Hi, I'm Steve Fernari. I'm the founder of the Flagler ESE Support Group. I'm here today with Janet McDonald, who's running for Flagler County School Board in District 2 in the August 28th primary election. Ms. McDonald is the incumbent candidate in a three-way race against challengers Jones and John Fischer. As a reminder, the school board election is a nonpartisan race, which means that any registered voter in Flagler County can cast a vote in all districts. Today, we'll be asking Ms. McDonald questions about her positions on exceptional student education in Flagler Schools. We've given all the candidates in the school board race an opportunity to interview with us, and we'll be asking every candidate the same questions, but possibly different follow-up questions where warranted. Welcome, Ms. McDonald, and thank you for agreeing to talk to Flagler County's ESE community.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. This is unique. I appreciate the extra effort on your part.
So according to a recent article in the Daytona News Journal, there are approximately 1,900 ESE students in Flagler Schools, which is just shy of 15% of the entire student population. How well versed are you on current issues about special education issues? And do you have any special experience with or personal connection to exceptional student education?
Well, I have to say that thinking about your question, it goes back to when I was a student. I think I've seen the whole range of how we address different from the norm. I went to school in the 50s and 60s in Connecticut, and we didn't have a lot of special ed students in our population. And then in junior high and high school, they started returning to the public schools for funding reasons back then. And yet it was in a separate classroom, and it was just not in the main flow of things. Then I'm an educator by trade, and I saw a lot of shifts when I was in the professional field in Connecticut and Pennsylvania, and found that we were starting to address more and more of the different abilities, but not necessarily in full inclusion model. There would be events to connect and to experience, but not necessarily in the main flow of things. To the full-blown event up in Connecticut, where we were doing far more inclusion, and I think like Flagler, it was cart before the horse sometimes, where we would do the inclusion without necessary supports, without necessary training, and it was always a catch-up system. And I think that's one of the things that is encouraging to me about the fact that we're looking at making the right adjustments so that inclusion is possible to the extent that it's best for the students, with more training, more staff, more appropriate touch points to reflect and see how we're doing in Flagler. I think we still have a way to go, but we're working better toward that least restrictive environment, and I'm expecting that we'll look at more professional and paraprofessional support to make any of the bridges that we need work more seamlessly. I think it's always a matter of money in anything you do in education, especially in Florida. And yet we need to support our classroom professionals, our special educator professionals, and our support staff that interfaces with these folks all the time. And I think it's that dance that you do with every exceptionality, because it's the full range from most needy to most advanced students. So I think our current special ed director, education director, Dr. King, is very mindful of all the differences that need to be addressed. And unfortunately, in a public school system, we have to take the time to address them adequately and appropriately. And sometimes that's not as instantly as what we'd like to do.
So you've mentioned a few things as being issues in the development of the inclusion program and the lack of or the need for more paraprofessionals. Would you say that those are the top two current issues in ESE from your perspective, or are there other pressing issues?
Well, I think the training of the staff across the board is really important, and just thinking in broader terms about what we all as a school district could do to support that as well. I know from, excuse me, from my own students, my own children, they had different exceptionalities. And it was always a dance of what we needed to front load at home, what we needed to communicate to teachers, and how we supported the bubbles that came up along the way. Because, any system, once you put it in place, life comes up and shows you that, well, maybe we need to adjust something a little differently. So I don't think it's a static system. And I think that's when, in the past, systems have gone awry, because it's a static, this is what we're going to do, rather than let it evolve and grow as we see it's working or not working, and how do we adjust it to make it work better for everybody who's involved, especially, on the delivery end.
So there's this perception among ESE parents that the district administration is insensitive to parent struggles, which causes considerable frustration among parents. In a recent survey of our support group members, 48% of parents felt that the district is more of an adversary versus 16% have viewed the district as a partner. Many ESE parents have hired advocates or lawyers. A high percentage of parents have removed their children from the district and placed their children in private school or are homeschooling. And recently, there's been chatter among ESE parents about filing a class action lawsuit against the district for, among other things, violating IDEA, failing to provide a free and appropriate public education, and for discrimination. Parent-district relations can have a massive impact on the district and taxpayers. So if elected or re-elected, what would you do to improve relations between ESE parents and district administration?
Well, I certainly applaud the effort that you've started with your group, Steve, in that it's got to be open communication. And I think what's happened in the past is that issues ferment because they haven't been addressed. They haven't been at the table and done in a measured way, so that issues could be aired and then solutions could be created among the groups. And I know that the openness of the district has certainly developed from where it was, and yet there's still some lingering expectations that the district isn't providing enough. And I think in light of the efforts that are being done to hopefully provide the right personnel at the right places to not only monitor the progress of what's going on in the new system, but to have this parent advisory group be another vehicle for folks to connect and to share ideas, so that their ideas can not be seen as isolates or as single issues with a single child, but maybe more system-wide, that we need to address system-wide. I think that's what happens without advocacy groups on both sides, from the district, what our system is, and then the parents, how we're receiving it. If we're not communicating as groups, it's the energies are deflected. And so there's not a whole lot of forward progress. So I think in that collaboration between the district wanting the parent group to be available to parents of special needs kids and wanting to communicate, I think it goes a long way to setting us up for success rather than for continuous challenge and conflict, because that doesn't help anyone. That dissipates efforts, and it uses funds in ways that are different from what really helps the kids. So I'd rather divert our funds to direct services rather than to legal measures, if we can.
And what Ms. McDonald is talking about is currently there's a parent advisory group that is being formed, which will be a collaborative effort between parents and district administration. That's currently in the process. And that's one example of many positive things that are happening in ESE throughout the district. And I think we can both agree that the district struggles with getting their message out to the ESE community. What would be your recommendation for the district to be more effective with that process?
Well, I was pleased to see that the communication from the parent advisory group, which is going to be parents and special educators and people from the district, is going to be presented on the website. So easy access for people that aren't part of the group. communication is going to be broadly spread by your group so that more people can be part of the conversation, at least part of the knowledge base, to allow them to then engage with the conversation. Because as the last round went, board members don't know what they don't know. District people don't know what they don't know. So until we can get the parents feeling comfortable to really communicate and have it be collected in a way that can make positive change for lots of folks, I think we'll struggle. But I'm hopeful that this is a wonderful vehicle with good distribution mechanisms to engage more people.
So ESE parents routinely feel that decisions are made by the district that have a material impact on their children without the input of stakeholders, including parents, teachers, and therapists. What's your position on getting stakeholders more involved in district decisions?
Other than the vehicles that we've just mentioned, I think just underscoring the fact that we really do want to hear from parents. We really do want to have there be more information rather than less. And, you know, it's those voids or those hiccups in communication that lead for misunderstandings or not finishing a conversation to real completion so it's operational. And if we can all work in order to come to a real clear awareness of what situations are, it would be a real benefit from both ends. So I guess just to continue to share ideas with the thought that it's a conversation. We all have a position that we are in, and yet if we don't hear the other side of the conversation, we can't service the parents and we can't know what the parents are feeling unless they share their information. So it's that two-way street. And I think that goes for every student. When we have really good communication with our parents, no matter what the student's situation is or parent needs, there's far more response that's available from the district because we're more aware of what we might be able to provide that's kind of holding up whatever is giving that student or that family an issue.
Now, part of this is part of getting stakeholders involved is cultural, right? Organizational culture. And you, as school board member, ultimately the only way that you can affect change is by getting in the ear of the superintendent. You know, what would you tell or recommend to the superintendent to help change the culture of being more inclusive of getting stakeholders involved in district decisions?
Well, you know, I think, and I think, so back to that, the superintendent, I think in the fact that he is supporting this whole district-wide awareness of every stakeholder group, every element in our community needs to be successful. And so this whole Graduate 100 isn't just for the kids that are in regular ed, isn't just for the kids that are in upper level, isn't just for a certain ethnic group or a certain racial group. It's for everyone. And he made that very clear at the opening for this year when he did kind of like a real people demonstration of what the subgroups in our population might look like. And if this is the body of that subgroup, how many of these wonderful kids are you willing to let not graduate? It was a commitment on the part of the whole district that we want everybody to be serviced the way they can so they can have eventual success across that finish line, you know? And I think with the focus, we don't really focus on grades. We focus now in our looking at how our program should be different on what could we do different for this child? What can we do different for this group of children? And how do we fine tune our instruction? So it's not just, well, we're just gonna have them in the class and hope for the best. It's very targeted, it's very thoughtful, it's very, very much directed at how they receive it, not just what we need to teach. How do we need to deliver it in order for them to be successful? And then monitor it, make sure those connections are there and parents are on board too, because it's that full loop of not only what the child receives in class, but what is that parent expecting? How can that parent support? what can they do? Not that they're educators at home, which is all great and wonderful, but how can they support their student through this time and keeping the motivation up around the clock?
This is a good segue to the next question, actually. And our local online news publication does an interview of all of the candidates and all of the local races, including the school board. And this year, in the candidate interviews, Flagler Live, candidates were asked about the district's most recent B grade or B rating and how to improve it. And the consensus among the candidates was to improve outcomes for the bottom quartile, which is the sort of lowest 25% of the student population. Mm-hmm. And the thought is that this will contribute significantly to improving the district's overall grade. Of course, ESE students make up a large percentage of the bottom quartile. One of the things mentioned to bring up the bottom quartile was tracking those students earlier in the school year so they can get the supports necessary to move forward in their education. Yet ESE parents are routinely report being told by district staff that their children will have to fail for a year before being considered for support. And then once they do get support, many parents complain that the supports aren't adequate for their children to be successful. So based on our experience, earlier tracking alone isn't enough. If elected, what would you do to ensure the district administration improves supports for ESE students?
Right. And I think that whole scenario is all about what happens before they are identified for ESE services. Almost like they're attempting to give those kids a second and third and fourth chance at hearing the material. But what we know in education is the first best instruction is what gets kids over the humps, which what keeps them out of that failure mode, because the more you revisit something, the less inviting and the less engaging it is sometimes for kids. So to have the focus right now that we're having, which is different from that, is that we're looking at learning gains, not just the content for that. We're not really looking for failure. We're looking at what is happening with those kids and what are they needing after that first bite and giving that to them right away. ESE kids are being looked at, and this is across the spectrum, what can enhance their receiving, what can enhance their mode of learning this, and what kinds of activities do they need different from what we've given them before. So it's all about the learning gains that they make, not just that they get the next grade or they're out of that quartile, because from where kids start, you're not necessarily going to make a quartile jump, but as long as you can show learning gains, there you're showing progress. So we're looking for progress, not for quantum leaps. And I think that's more measured. That way we don't miss the links that connect learning to learning. And it's through association that we learn. And so those pieces of what are the elements of the foundation that they need, let's get those in place so we can make learning gains throughout this process. So it's more strategic, it's more precise, and it's monitored a little differently from what we've done in the past. I don't know if I answered that carefully enough for you.
Well, I think, the question goes towards sort of getting in the trenches of what parents are experiencing on a day-to-day basis, right? Because that's the reality that the members of our group live in. And so their experience is that, they're being told by guidance counselors that their children are going to have to fail to get an IEP fail for a year before getting an IEP. And I don't believe that that's the district's policy position at the district level. In fact, I've heard obviously differently from the superintendent, but there seems to be a problem at the school level. And then additionally, once they are identified, parents are reporting that they're struggling to get the supports necessary for their kids to be. Their kids are not, even though they're identified, the kids are still not being successful. Right. And they attribute that to lack of supports. And so I think the district administration theoretically is on the right track. In practice, what is happening is not matching the theoretical. And so how do you recommend the superintendent bridges that gap, and what can you do to influence?
Well, and, I think in a lot of ways, this is the MTSS process that's been driven down by the state. And this is the way to make sure that you're not giving up kids' ability to learn in their own pace. And yet you don't want them to work and work and work until they fail in order to get the extra support. You already know if they're not really picking up. And I think that's what's different. The teachers themselves, with the kids who are identified and the kids who aren't, have a different view of what's possible now for the kids who haven't been identified. They're not looking for failure. They're keeping certainly an awareness of what's presenting and what's staying with the child and what the child can benefit from incorporating that into the next step. But that's also part of the whole learning process that we have that really needs the inclusion of the parents along the way. What's really happening at home? What are you seeing at home? What can we do to have this be practiced at home as well, so that we can have your child come back to school with this in their back pocket, rather than just wait for a segment of the day when we go over it here and then it's not practiced at all. And I think better communication between home and individual teachers is important, as well as appropriate activities. One of the things that I know is frustrating for a lot of parents is the activities that are engaging just the technology for review. I think kids learn better by real activities, real hands-on, engaging kinds of events. And I also know that we don't want to make their life virtual, because that's a very abstract thing. And a lot of the kids that are not being successful haven't had enough concrete experiences. So more concrete, more hands-on, more real working with information, and having a playful way with it at home would be a better way to continue that loop of engagement for the kids, so that they could come back. And mom and dad could actually, or any caregivers, any guardians, could have more of an insight into what really works for their child. What do they enjoy? What could I share with that teacher that we did at home that really made a difference for our child? Because as you know, and as I know as a parent, it doesn't only happen at school. And I think, not that I'm trying to give the burden to the parents, but I know that sometimes for my students, my own personal children, that we had to rephrase things in different ways. We had to play with things a little differently. And sometimes those keys that we find at home are nuggets for the teachers to take advantage of, in order for there to be, that continuous loop, that we're all working to the best outcomes for that child.
So Flagler Schools has a large population of students affected by autism spectrum disorder, which I'll refer to as ASD.
Yeah.
In fact, 52% of our support group members have a child affected by ASD. Applied behavioral analysis, also known as ABA therapy, is an evidence-based science in which behavior modifications are systematically applied to improve behavior to a meaningful degree. ABA has been widely described as one of the most effective treatment for children with ASD and similar learning disorders, leading to substantial, lasting improvements in the lives and education of children with autism, and improves reading and writing skills. ABA therapy has been endorsed by the U.S. Surgeon General, the NIH, and the Association for Science in Autism Treatment. Flagler Schools currently has only one behavior specialist for 1,900 students and no therapist certified in ABA therapy. If improving outcomes for the bottom quartile by providing supports is a district goal, how is the district meeting this goal if it's failing to provide the right kinds of support?
That is such a great question, and I'm going to put on my other hat right now. As a neurodevelopmental therapist, I've had lots and lots of experience with folks on the spectrum and any other label that the special ed population has. And what my experience is that ABA works for a certain portion of the population. As the saying goes, when you've seen one autistic child, you've seen one autistic child. And I've seen excellent results from Sunrise, from the Moscatova reflex integration therapies, from the rhythmic movement therapies that I've done, because those build up the kids from inside. And what ABA does is outside interventions for guiding and behavior modification kinds of things. And you can learn that way, and yet that doesn't generally transfer into other areas. And so behavior modification is an interesting technique that works for some, and yet I wouldn't want that to be our sole response to any designation, any diagnosis.
So I use ABA therapy as an example, and I'm not suggesting that the district go all in on ABA therapy,
Okay.
But it does seem striking to me that there's only one behavior specialist for 1,900 students, and this is a chronic complaint for our members, especially those with children affected by ASD. Mm-hmm. And so, whether it be ABA therapy or other kinds of therapy or other kinds of behavior therapy or any kind of therapy, if the parents are reporting that they're not getting enough supports, and that's part of the district's goal to improve the district's grade, it strikes me as that they have this plan in place but don't have the right tools to execute it. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, I guess when it comes down to it, with a general population like that, ABA is a very specific, individualized, high-intensity program. I know from fellow therapists who do that work that it is highly concentrated, high-impact, one-on-one, and considerable follow-up. I don't know that any school district has the resources to do that. I know that when we have behaviorists come in and do an evaluation, that can give teachers, especially our special ed teachers, who have other opportunities for movement and stimulation with different music and sound and rhythm and color and art and things like that. When you have those kinds of input for this group, we also, I don't know that we do anything with listening therapies in our realm in general, but those are all inputs for those folks on the spectrum, because they are the most highly involved nervous system wise. You need that kind of thing rather than the cognitive top down, you will do this, you won't do that kind of thing, because they live from a point of protection rather than from a point of cognition and connection. And so if you're training a behavior, that's one thing. But if you want to actually develop that child, I think we need to look at what are some of the other inputs that we have in our system that would actually support the nervous system development from within, to allow those kids to have more connections. And I think some of our teachers that specialize with this this diagnosis or this label have other inputs in their day that actually help to bridge some of those things, rather than have it be just an ABA therapy input. But I think a behavior evaluation is really good. I think that gives keys to situations that would be beneficial to put into a child's life or into a child's school day, and avoid others. But I don't think that we have the ability as a school district, as a public school district with funding, to be able to afford a one-on-one ABA therapist for any or all of our students on the spectrum. I don't know that we're there yet as a society that believes that we can provide the personalized therapies across the board for anyone.
But back to the previous question, because these two questions are interrelated.
Right.
If the plan for the district is to raise up the bottom quartile, and we raise up the bottom quartile by identifying
the bottom quartile early and then providing adequate supports. Do you think that the district has adequate supports in place, not ABA therapy, not limited to ASD, but adequate supports in place for the bottom quartile and specifically ESE for those students to be successful?
You know, and this isn't just for the folks in the ESE population. This is for all of our students. As you know, the funding in Florida is probably among the lowest in the nation. I think if we looked at some of the places that are actually doing a superior job in this area, we'd look at vastly different numbers, because we have the ability to actually hire enough professionals to be supports along the way, not only in trained classroom teachers with a broader expectation, a broader bag of modifications in their tool bag, but then support personnel for strategic kind of teaching, strategic therapies, strategic collaboration with other people, and the transition people, the paraprofessionals that actually do a lot of the implementing and the daily routines and things. I'm always torn on how do we get more money for our kids? How do we show them that we're doing such a great job in Flagler Schools, that the state needs to give us positive money back rather than supporting the districts that are doing not such a good job and they get more money to see if that more money could do a job? We have shown in lots of ways, maybe not enough in the special needs area, but we have shown in a lot of ways that our money is getting a big return on investment. So maybe we could get some legislation behind this and do some pilots on what would it take to do a really soundly outfitted program with personnel that is not excessive, but is strategic, is targeted, and actually serving the needs of the population, as we know would be best for them.
So other candidates have that I've spoken with in these interviews, you know, we've talked about this issue, and I've gotten several responses from candidates where they've said if the district administration comes to them with a budgetary need, that they would find the funds, that there were always funds. So are you suggesting that there are no additional funds to find for additional supports, or that you're unwilling to find funds, or that, you know, these other candidates are not being truthful with their constituents?
I'm not sure if these are folks that currently serve on the board, but I think people in general have the idea that we have unlimited funds. You've been through the numbers of what our populations get for funds, both for classroom teachers and then for any of the ESE designations, and how that's portioned out. I think someone would be hard pressed to say that the numbers that we get from the state are sufficient to actually do a program that we're talking about. We're talking about adequately funding a program that serves the needs so that the parents are happy, the teachers feel supported and can do their job adequately, and the outcome is a stellar outcome for the child. That's always our goal, and that's always what we work for, but we do it with a bare bones kind of population in the professional staff and the paraprofessional staff, which is not always happy for the parents because they know that there are gaps in what their child could be receiving if there were people along that child's day that could support those needs.
So if the district's strategy, again, back to their strategy of improving their grade by early detection and providing supports, I mean, doesn't it sound like it's doomed for failure if we cannot provide the adequate supports if the budget's not there? I mean, it's sort of it's doomed for failure at the outset.
It's never doomed for failure, but we come to a point of that is the end of our economic ability.
Mm-hmm.
And so what do we do with that? We have professionals in our district, by and large, that take it out of their personal time and heart and energy and pocketbooks and do what they need to do. I don't know one teacher that says, I can't spend 5 more minutes with this child. They do. They go be over and above what is normally required just to make those kids successful. They are always fine-tuning what they're doing in their collaborative groups as they can. And yet the end of the day comes and we have to send those children home. We can't keep them. And it's that continuous loop of the day that I think is an important one that we could communicate better about. But I also think that if we're really expecting to have everything we need for any population in our schools, we have to be really honest about the money. It's easy to say there's always money, and yet when we're, the 62nd now out of 67 counties in funding for regular education, and not much better in our special education numbers. And we have to ask our population to do more than other counties. Our required local effort is among the highest. We're already tapping into that. We have an incredible business base that supports all kinds of programs. I don't know if we can get a benefactor to do a special education flagship and get people behind that. It would be another way to tap into the community. What special programs could we do that would have a flagship kind of feel to it that would be honoring in this regard? Because the regular education that's provided by the legislature in Tallahassee does not really provide what ESE parents and the legislation say should be provided. And I think that's part of the rub, because legislation is very easy to craft. And yet delivery at the other end is real people, real money, real time constraints. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the reality that we need to work within. And yet Flagler Schools teachers, by and large, are, especially in this population, are hand-selected. Getting out and being included into the regular classrooms is that growth area that we obviously have. Better training, better communication among our people, so that we're not taxing people beyond what they're ready to deliver. So
along those lines, I think, and we touched about this before, approximately 4 years ago, the district moved ESE to a full inclusion model, and students, parents, teachers, and staff are still struggling with it. Parents are unhappy because their children aren't making the educational gains that they'd like to see, and teachers, especially gen ed teachers in inclusion classes, are unhappy because they feel unsupported. What's your ideas for resolving this issue?
I think, as our data shows, full inclusion, we have the highest inclusion in the state and the lowest scores. Obviously, the pendulum swung too broadly for too many, because, just like that other comment, just because you have a certain designation of your ability or your different ability doesn't mean that you're just like the child next to you with that same designation. And so specific and targeted and well-supported rollouts are the only thing I've seen over my career that actually work. A full push out without enough training in the field for those receiving teachers, enough paraprofessionals. And I also heard that regular paraprofessionals who were known and appreciated by parents and students were then reassigned for that push out. So those kids were put out there without real tethers of comfort. So you set any program up for success by front loading it with the best connections, the best preparation, the best training, and the slow and steady. Let's start here. Let's go to step 2. Let's go to step 3. Diving into the deep end when you can't swim is not a really good idea.
The families totally agree with you, but here we are 4 years later.
Absolutely.
We can't go back. So
we can't go back. And yes,
right?
Yeah, that's true. So what do? We're pulling back some in order to make it more comfortable for people, in order to make it more successful for people. And I think that's where people are still unsure, because they were asked to trust that last system and it was not comfortable. This is a new system. It's same district, same parents. how can I trust this system when we weren't successful there and I did trust the system? And it took a long time before the system readjusted and said, okay, let's bring this back. And I think our readjustment in our special ed leadership and the direction that Dr. King is headed is with measured support and full communication, or better communication. I know there have been some gaps in communication already that haven't felt comfortable. So
what does pulling back look like? What is that? How does that resolve the issue?
For the students that are obviously very, very much out of the element of comfort in those situations, I would pull back there. I would also pull back
meaning placing in self-contained classrooms?
No, just pulling back from the assignment that they're in if it's not successful in other assignments. We had some teachers that were not really ready for a full inclusion model. If those teachers were not trained, they were just told that you'll have a special ed facilitator with you or a paraprofessional, and yet to work collaboratively with 3 professionals in one classroom takes an incredible amount of new professional training. That should be tried for a year or half a year before you ever involve real rollout for lots of people, because it takes coordinating planning, it takes coordinating understanding the material, it takes coordinating understanding what these kids need specifically for their delivery, for their understanding, for their outcomes. And yet just sitting next to a child is not really a support, it's just being in the room. So there are so many nuances of co-teaching, collaborative teaching, inclusion model that I don't think people had it under their belts. They were kind of learning as they go, and that's never comfortable. And you don't know how far away from the model you're getting until you get to these measurement points, quarterlies, midterms, end of the year, and you say, whoa, that wasn't real successful. That's wasted time for kids. And you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that you're communicating, measuring along the way. And I think that's what's in place now. We have far more touch points. We expect people to be communicating all the time and collaboratively working on, a look across the classroom tells you one thing, rather than you've got another student in your classroom that you have to teach them how you want them to interface with the students in your classroom. So the working of the professionals, whether they're co-teachers or paraprofessionals or aides on any level, has to be seamless. So it's not another lesson that has to go on. So the lesson of the classroom is actually the education that the kids are receiving. So that may be too much nitty-gritty professional end of the work, but a lot of the times that's what holds up education from happening.
So in a survey that we conducted of our members, we asked them, given similar educational outcomes, would you prefer the inclusion teaching model over self-contained classes or other types of inclusive teaching models? And 64% of our parents prefer inclusion.
Yeah.
And it was the parents who didn't were those whose children had very significant behavioral issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so clearly, I think your constituents want inclusion. They want inclusion to work. So are we talking about improving inclusion, or are we talking about, when you talk about pulling back, are we not doing inclusion? So
oh, it's definitely a work to having it be least restrictive environment, more inclusion, but you have to have it set up for success for the students. You can't put them in a room without folks who are really ready to collaboratively teach and be supportive within the flow of a classroom. And that's what I think we did differently. We're actually training people to do that better. We're actually learning better supports for each other, better touch points, better communication links. I don't think that the district is wanting less inclusion, but if we're going to do inclusion, we have to do it right. so that the kids aren't just in a classroom, they're actually learning and they're supported in that learning. And
So you mentioned
when their
earlier,
kids are included are not appropriate, they're in a classroom or a situation that's better for them. Sorry about that.
sure, no problem. In the beginning of our conversation, you had mentioned that you had seen the rollout of an inclusion program in Connecticut,
Right.
and I'm curious, was that program? I mean, you said it kind of cart got a little bit before the horse, much in the same way that we did at Flagler Schools. And I'm wondering if you can, obviously, budgetary issues are completely different, different states. But where are we at in terms of, was that program eventually turned around? And if yes, how do we relate to your experience there?
Well, I don't think that we had up in Connecticut had, our districts are very small. We have, our municipalities are the school districts.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't have the numbers that we're talking here in Flagler, first of all. But what we had at the time in our special ed classrooms was all abilities were in a special ed classroom, so that that teacher did not have a lot of differentiation ability within that. So the students that were not ready to be included because of stimulation for them, going into a full classroom was too much stimulation, so they were not going to be part of the inclusion. But the other folks were just going to be consult inclusion, which was putting them out there without real support. They had had pretty close support in their classroom, and even though they were ready to be part of an inclusion classroom, they didn't have the professionals coming around often enough or on a regular basis for key content areas to make them successful. And that's how that one fell short. Adding the personnel, reallocating personnel during the key times in those classrooms is what made that work. So any system can be revised and improved. If you're looking at what are the elements that are working, let's keep those going, and let's look at what are the elements that need to be adjusted, and who needs more training, what different kinds of time do we need for our people to get together to plan, so it's seamless delivery rather than planning as you go during delivery. That's never very comfortable, and it takes time from education.
So it's interesting. Our perception about the change to inclusion and then putting things in place to improve inclusion, including training, is that we've come up against a culture issue. And so when it comes to ESE, the district seems to have a culture problem, especially in terms of ESE inclusion. A culture of not wanting students with disabilities in general education classrooms because it's hard or inconvenient, a culture of being opaque about what's actually happening in the classroom, a culture of engaging in the quote unquote, we're the experts and we know what's best for your child types of attitude. The culture is gradually changing, but district staff with this old guard mentality, they create liability for the district by routinely engaging in discriminatory actions or violating special education laws. What do you think the culture should be as it relates to ESE, and what would you do if reelected to help foster that culture change?
Well, I think we're already in the culture change, and that the message from the district is that we're going to be refining what we do and improving what we do, because everyone needs access to the least restrictive environment with the supports that support that child without taking away from the needs of the classroom. I think we're always balancing that as well. So we have some classrooms that are operating with co-teaching model now, and it's working very well. And so part of it is what we did before wasn't what we want to replicate all the time, but I'm sure that there were some partnerships that were positive out of that. Those are the things that are being culled and continued and developed. There are things that Dr. King has researched elsewhere, different models, and that's where, we have our current model that he feels will be more effective, that we can get more services into the students rather than in personnel that are kind of just managing the system. So if we can shift to that model, we'll have more access to more direct services in the classrooms. Anything is new, and you kind of have to support the reluctance on the part of teachers who felt they weren't doing as good a job as they could with better supports. So going a little bit more measured into this next realm and yet successful, and then championing those successes will be a really strong message to folks that pulling back a little bit to the with appropriate personnel and appropriate training, and then seeing those successes will go a long way to having other folks say, you know, this is great from the community, from the parents' perspective, first of all. And I hope that we all have better communication coming up this year, so that things don't fester, that things don't feel like they're not being heard, that we actually close those loops and continue to make changes in the classrooms as we can. The culture is always going to go in the direction of the loudest voice. And so when we can show more and more success and we can champion those successes, that's the message that I'd like to get out there. And I'd like to not quiet down the ones that are saying this isn't working yet. I want to find out why it's not working, and how do we make that, the ones that are successful, how do we impact those that aren't working yet? What isn't happening there? How can we make that happen? Because it's only through working together that we can actually improve the of areas that aren't working well.
So I totally agree with you, and that's a big reason why we were instrumental in starting a pilot inclusion program at Old Kings Elementary for the purpose of showing success to not only the other teachers in that school, but to the other teachers in that district. But it definitely does seem that the schools are a little bit siloed, because there are pockets of success. Like you said, that there's a classrooms with co-teaching models that's successful, which to be between me and you, it's news to me. I know it's something that was discussed at Old Kings, and there's some questions about whether or not there were resources in place to actually do a co-teach classroom because it's more expensive. So, I mean, what do we do to improve the siloing in the schools, so that we can sort of take best practices and start sharing them across the spectrum of the districts? Now, I think the parent council is one way that may help that, but what are some other ways that we can start to knowledge share between schools, between professionals?
Well, and I think that's one of the benefits of having the new staffing specialist alignment the way it is. They'll see different things happening across the board. And it's not unlike the other day when I was helping at kindergarten bus drop off at Rimfire. I know their staggered flow and how seamless it was with all these kids going in lots of different directions. And it was different from what I had experienced at another school. And I thought, wow, why don't we share this? And the Rimfire administrator said, we should really do that. All of our systems that work really well, we should be getting together and doing that. And I know that's part of Dr. King's new design, to have the staffing specialist be part of that communication link, but to have regular conversations with his team members all the time about what's working, what's not working, how can we make this work. He's very much a not let it go until it fails guy. We want to make sure that things are successful. And so he's big on communication, both in print and in person. He's out there everywhere. And I think it's a new system, but I think the people I've met trust him and know that information that they give him will be held as it needs to be, or distributed as it needs to be. Success models are the ones that we want to champion and support the people that may be needing some extra support. But this year is, we only want the success out of this program. We do not want it to be a repeat on the last model, for sure.
So speaking of the staffing specialist change, As you're aware, there was a very big reorganization of the district staffing specialists last spring, rolled out for this school year. And with the ESE community, they had some serious concerns about this change. And the community approached the school board for help after getting inconsistent information from district information about it. We felt like we couldn't get a straight answer.
Yeah.
Staffing specialists came before the school board at a workshop on May 15th. Now, the public is not given an opportunity to ask questions of district administration or get direct responses at school board meetings. So our support group prepared approximately 60 questions on about 6 pages that we wanted asked. And did not believe that all 60 questions would be asked, but we wanted to frame the issue as we felt that it should be, and to help the school board member with a nuanced issue. So at that meeting, only 3 board members asked questions from that list, and we believe it was less than 5 questions from the list that were asked in total, and there was not one follow-up question asked after district admin gave its responses. The takeaway was that parents felt that the school board, their elected representatives, didn't make sure that their concerns were fully addressed. In the event a similar situation arises with respect to ESE, if reelected, what would you do to ensure that the parents feel that their concerns are addressed on the public record?
Right. So addressing it on the public record at a meeting is probably too short a window for actually researching, getting things back, and having enough time to do that. So I think part of what I like about the Parent Advisory Board, the ESE Advisory Council, is that it will allow for communication around the year because it's never a once and done kind of question. There's always follow-up. There's always something to do. There's always research to do. And there's also programmatic changes that need to be made if that's the case. So unfortunately, I would love it to be a one question, one answer. We're good to go with that at school board meetings, but usually, especially all of the questions that were posed were things that had to actually go through the cycle of the district before the school board would be working on a policy. And that's the thing, that we can ask questions, we can probe a little bit, but they had the questions to then research. The district does that work. The school board encourages, the school board expects, and the school board supports all that work to find these answers. And yet we're the ones that we can't actually just, we can be nosy, we can, and seek out answers ourselves, but those questions were pretty much what the district's response was to the community. And so finding that how those things were incorporated into the new programming was more in line with where the board sits from. How do you incorporate these questions? How do you incorporate these mismatches? How do we address these things? And because they were all related to how do we make our programs better? And so the programmatic changes happen with district personnel. And I think those are all the ones that can be addressed right now are being addressed with the new system. And keeping the communication going with the ESE Advisory Council is another really, I'd have to say, well thought out, because it's on a regular basis, it's regular communication, and it gave me the feeling that nothing's going to be dropped. No ideas are going to be just left in the weeds because we forgot to ask that one again. They're all going to be monitored. They're all going to be pursued. And it's a collaboration between the district and the parents, the people who know these kids best.
So I'm gonna stop you there for a second, because I don't want to belabor this point, but I think that what the community was looking for with their questions that they had presented to the school board to ask of the administration was to clarify certain things that were being said. In other words, the community was doing the right things. We were speaking with the superintendent of the schools, we were meeting with the ESE director, and we were getting inconsistent information, not just from leaders of the community, but even individual members of the community, because we compared notes. And so our recourse, our only recourse, was to go to the superintendent's boss, which is the school board, to ask the hard questions, to dig into the responses, to sort of get to the bottom of what is truth, right? And I think, you know, we as community members, I think we're okay with receiving change or bad news, but I think we want the full story, and we want, you know, again, back to the communication piece. And I agree with you that I think that the parent council will help resolve these issues. Certainly would have resolved this particular issues. But I think what parents want to know is that if we end up in a place like this on a different issue, we want to be able to count on school board members to ask the hard questions. And we walked away from that experience thinking, geez, nobody asked the hard questions. Some of the board members asked no questions. And that was, as you can imagine, very frustrating for parents and for the community. I mean, how would you respond to that?
Well, sometimes board members are differently aware of the issues, and they wait to see how it plays out with the district personnel. So if they had no personal questions or no wonderings, feeling that all those questions were going to be researched and we were going to get return information on those questions from the district staff, that some folks feel the meeting is the board's meeting on issues that they need to have preparation for. And since there wasn't enough information to actually act on, all those questions were presented to the district, and they probably felt that that was where it needed to be for now. And then the follow-up on either our personal or individual meetings with the superintendent or any of the district personnel, the ESE staff, that's where that information would be supplied. We don't do all of our research and all of our questioning in public, especially if folks feel it would be redundant to keep asking the same questions in public before the staff had a chance. To research it and have an appropriate answer or a sufficient answer for the board. We do not want to, it's the board's meetings are not to play gotcha with any district personnel. If there were things that they needed to research, we want to give them the opportunity to have a full and complete answer. And oftentimes it's with a full and complete response to whatever the question was, whatever the lack was, whatever the problem is, for this is how we feel we're going to address it. Because it's never just getting information. It's, okay, what are we going to do with this information? Our district is very, very, very tightly employed in that we do the same thing we provide the same range of opportunities as large districts with a fraction of the personnel. Our personnel are they're pretty incredible with the amount of work that they do for our district. And so sometimes we forget that other districts have teams of people in these capacities to do this work. And yet we're doing our best to get a full team effort that you'd see in another district out to our folks. So it does take time when you have limited staff.
So going back to the Flagler Live interviews, all of the candidates who responded were asked what their vision was for public education in Flagler County. Only one candidate mentioned ESE in their response. Actually, that was you. And so we wanted to give all of the candidates an opportunity to address the ESE community. So in this regard, what is your vision for ESE in Flagler County, and how do you expect to achieve that?
Well, obviously, it's that we're here to educate all of our kids to the best of our ability. And ESE folks are, I don't want to say this perceived in a bad way, but they are lucky in that they have more documentation and more expectations on paper that we can be accountable for, different from other school populations. And yet every population in our schools, in my belief, every individual is a special individual, and every child deserves the best education we can possibly give to them. ESE has more obvious needs, more legislated expectations, which is great, and I appreciate that. And so I just want them all to be Flagler kids, but I want to serve each child. I want Flagler schools to serve each child as best they can, and part of that is I know that we all are hardwired with potential, unlimited potential. And it's our job to tap into that potential and to stimulate it so that it actually creates the best next opportunity for every one of our kids. So how do we do that? A lot of heart in our classrooms, a lot of collaboration between families and schools, our business community, our mentors, all of those people go into making a very well supported environment for our kids. Could we use more mentors? Yes. Could we use better communication links? Always. You know, that term Flagler family gets used a lot. And I think if we can become more family oriented and for every student, working for the best for that student and not being adversarial at any point, and just receiving information as information that we could most likely act on, that's what I'd like to see for every child. And we have designated expectations for and obligations for our ESE population. And I think we're working in line with doing a better job with that. So every day can be an improvement. That's the only reason why I'm here, to see if we can every day do an improvement for all of our kids. I don't have any kids in Flagler schools, but every one of them is, you know, that's why we do what we do in Flagler schools. Every one of them is important.
Well, thank you so much for addressing the ESE community. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this. If voters want to learn more information about your candidacy, where can they do that?
Well, I tweet a lot on the school. So it's USA One Mom is the Twitter thing, but it's and in the fly as I go. I'm always available through my school my school email, McDonaldJ@Flagler Schools. My cell phone is my work phone, 386-852-9014. I've been sending out materials. Don't hesitate to contact me through those means, or let's see, I think there's a Facebook page, but I haven't figured out how to use it yet. I don't have time for Facebook. Sorry, folks. I set it up, but I haven't used it yet. So if anyone wants to tutor me, I'm happy to engage them with payment. So I need to get a Facebook tutor.
Well, maybe one of the parents in our group could help you out.
Actually, the kids would do it for me. I'm sure they know Facebook better than I do.
Well, listen, good luck on your primary race and the general election if it goes to that. We really wish you the best of luck, and thank you.
Well, actually, I have a plug here. If I can get 50% plus one, I can just get back to work rather than campaigning. So
that sounds good. We'll try to help you out with that. All right.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Steve.